RH, quer saber como voar no trabalho? É só usar a Flash. Com a Flash, você concentra toda a gestão de pessoas em um único lugar. Faça a admissão dos colaboradores e solicite mais de 8 categorias de benefícios. Ah, e você ainda pode fazer todo o controle de ponto. Conheça o novo onboarding integrado da Flash em flashapp.com.br.
Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference.
Are you walking through something in a relationship or in a situation you have at work, or maybe something that has just been a curveball in your life that you don't really know how to walk through without some professional help? Well, if that is you, BetterHelp is here to help you. They sponsor this podcast. I myself have been helped by a BetterHelp therapist who I absolutely needed at a time in my life where I was working through some workplace abuse. And the things that she would say to me, give me to do in between our sessions that were weekly, just really transformed me. She walked me through some really, really hard things, and I've come out the other side with so much more freedom. And I just want to recommend it to you. There are professionals there that can help you walk through whatever it is, whether you're trying to figure out what's next for you, work through some tricky things in a relationship. Please check out betterhelp.com/difference for 10% off your first month. That's www.betterhelp.com/difference for 10% off your first month today. Hi, everyone out there around the world. I'm recording this today from the UK where I'm on a business trip, and we have been thinking about mental health recently because this week we commemorated World Mental Health Day, which happens every year on October 10th. And in light of that, in my workplace, we've been wearing green, and I've seen different people posting different ways you have been acknowledging this important day. Mental health is something that it affects so many different people in so many different ways, and it's worldwide. And so today I wanted to dig into an aspect of mental health in the area of trauma. Now, this is something we've covered on the podcast before in various ways, either authors who have talked about how to heal from trauma, or people who've experienced trauma themselves, or various versions of that mixed together. But today we're going to focus on trauma in the area of sexual abuse. So in light of that, if this is something that you yourself have experienced, or if you have little ears listening, I would just say that listener discretion is advised. And if you need to take this in chunks or not listen at all, that is totally up to you. Check with your gut and see what it says. But today we are having a special guest on the show, Cindy Benezra. Cindy is an accomplished author, a speaker, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and an advocate who is also a sexual abuse victim herself. She's very passionate and brings awareness to the impact of sexual trauma through meaningful conversations, through her writing, of course, and through just discussions about how to change systems. Her abuse occurred, unfortunately, at the hands of her very own father, and that's going to be at the center of our conversation today. It's something she writes about in detail in her memoir, but she also talks about various types of trauma and how she coped herself, and also how she herself found healing. Her book is called Under the Orange Blossoms, and her life has taken her also to many countries in her years of growing up, and due to the different nationalities of each of her parents, and also just, life growing up in multiple worlds really gives her a rich perspective on how to live this human life and the various options that are out there. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today too. So I'm very excited to welcome to the show today, Cindy Benezra. Hi, Cindy. Thanks for joining us today from Seattle. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Yeah, I'm actually not in my normal place. I do live in Northern California, but I'm here in near Bend, Oregon, in a cabin. This is not actually my home.
Wow.
Here for my kids. They've had October break, and so we're here over the weekend. It's been beautiful. I see some beautiful tall trees outside my window. We went to a fall festival. It's been really nice. And I see that you have a sunny day up there in Seattle, which is not really typical. So
it's beautiful. I always think it's a myth. I mean, we always say that it's terrible and miserable here, but it doesn't happen. It's only for 3 months. And then after that, it is miserable during those 3 months. Yes. And it rains all the time.
Yes, but you get a beautiful green Northwest that we all love, right? So, but I love, okay, so in your book, you start off with something that I think is really important because we're going to dig into some hard topics today. But you start off with some, what I feel like are some grounding techniques, as you're describing sunsets and oranges and the smells. And I know for many who have walked through abuse or trauma and have, gone through therapy, that mindfulness and grounding techniques can be especially helpful to remind us that we're here and we're now and it's not the past and we're okay. So I love that the title of your book is Under the Orange Blossoms. It's a courageous and powerful memoir. But before we get into that, I always like to get to know my guests a little bit and what cultures that formed you. I know in your first chapter, I was reading about Spain and Austria and Iran and Arizona and Mexico and a German accent. So you may have a long list, but what would you say are some of the cultures that formed you and your heritage?
I think it's being a child from parents that are immigrants and coming here and looking for the American dream and really trying to work extra, extra hard and to get their dream and to build that dream and to build a beautiful life for their family and for us. Just would remember my mom would have a day job and she would work in the evening as a seamstress and would sew in the evening and then also type up my dad's papers because he was getting his master's. And so way back then, they didn't have computers. So she was typing up his paperwork. And I remember my dad, he was a engineer. And so he was also a mechanic and he was working on the side doing that, odds and ends, very handy guy, very thrifty family. We were just trying to I always just remember a level of achievement with them and their expectations. And I never really thought anything other than that. Like we always had to do more. And that was just sort of challenge ourselves. So I thought I just remember, I don't know if it's that way for everybody else, but it was that spirit of just that American dream of how do we achieve that.
So beautiful. Yeah, I think that anybody who has the honor and privilege of being friends with people who immigrated to the United States or other countries in Europe and all around the world where people immigrate or have had the experience of being raised by parents who have immigrated, it's a unique experience. And we do see a lot of hard work, and having to rebuild a life in a new place is no small task. Your parents immigrated, though they were originally from two different places. You want to tell us a little bit more about their heritage?
Sure. My father's from Germany. So he came here when he was a young boy, merchant marine, and fell in love with Canada. And he just thought, oh my goodness, this is it. So then he migrated over here to the Northwest and then went to California. And my mom, she was first generation. Her parents are from Mexico and they spoke complete Spanish in the household. I believe at that time my grandmother didn't even speak English, so my mom was always the person who would translate. There were 5 children in that family, and I think it was interesting that her youngest brother was 18, so she was more of the caretaker in the family. Very traditional, very old world ideology and traditions.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And when you have those two different worlds coming together, one of like more of a cold culture German, ancestry, and then more of a warm culture Mexican. Sometimes those blend together into something altogether different, or sometimes a more dominant culture takes over. But for people who are raised kind of this third culture way, like you were, you kind of sometimes get to pick and choose a little bit. What would you say you identify more with in terms of a person and your own personal values?
I think growing up, all I was exposed to was my Mexican side of the family. So I think I related a lot to that because I didn't know anything different. And then when I became a teenager and I lived overseas and I was in boarding school in Austria, and I chose that area so that I could meet my German side of the family. And when I was exposed to that, I was like, oh my goodness, I am so German. And I thought, I think my thinking was very much like them. And so I found it really interesting. And then I realized that it's just what you want to identify yourself with. But I think their food, the music, the languages, that's what I really took back with me and it's still with me. It still resonates with me. And I really feel part of that. And when I came back to the States, the hardest part for me was I felt like a foreigner in my own country when I was 18. And I still have the travel bug. I'm still feel very connected to the rest of the world. And I feel we live in a very small, the world is so small.
I totally agree. And whenever we have, third culture kids on the podcast, there's always a connection in that way. And I feel like, and that's some of the research shows that you don't have to have had the same Venn diagram of cultures that form this third culture for you to connect with others who've had third culture experiences. And I do agree that the world is a very small place. Some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to be issues that are not exclusive to one culture. We're going to talk about sexual abuse within a family. And it's a very difficult thing to talk about. You have been so brave, not just to write about it in a memoir, which is so hard to do, and also speak about it. And, this isn't your job, but is a part of who you are in terms of your experience and the trauma that you've walked through. So with your book, Under the Orange Blossoms, which is an amazing title, and I hope everybody buys it and reads it. We'll link it in the show notes. I'd love for you to share what kind of inspired you to actually write these hard things down, and even how maybe the process of writing it helped you to find a space to heal for yourself.
So I wrote this, my daughter and I own an event company. And so I think I just thought it was a very great idea to write recipes of different cultures, things along my travels. And so I thought, I love to cook. So I just thought, what a fabulous idea. And cooking is very much like my shoes. They all have memories. And my shoes, when I walk, that's the one thing that I buy in my travels. I always think like, oh yes, I went on this trip. And cooking is very, very similar to that, where I sat down with somebody. I feel eating with somebody is a very personal experience. And well, I guess you can make it a very personal experience, but I really feel I connect most when I sit down with across the table from somebody and eat and experience that different foods. But in this process of writing down my recipes, I was going through the years, and let's say here, so it was from 5, and I am a grandmother now. So I was writing all these recipes basically of my lifetime. When I started my first recipe, it was a grilled cheese sandwich that Mrs. Anderson made, and it was my comfort food, and I have it in my childhood writing, and then she wrote parts of it, and I thought, you know what, let's talk basics here, like American food, grilled cheese sandwiches, and that is, that's some of our comfort food. And so I was writing these recipes, but as I was writing these recipes, I noticed that I would get triggered. I'd get triggered, and just to move on, it was just habit. I've always been a journaler. I would just take that thought, and it was it was a memory, a happy one, a sad one, a quotation. It was maybe a traumatic event. And I started writing them down on notepads in front of me, and I had them in their own category. They were all separated. And by the time I finished my recipes, I noticed that I had 5 little notepads filled. And what gave me the most joy was the cookbooks. I just thought entertaining tips, how do we make this faster? How do we make this convenient and on a budget and fabulous? But that did give me joy. But what was the most difficult, and if I could have covered it up with a napkin to hide the book even, I would have done that. That's how I felt. And I remember holding my hand over it and going, this is the most devastating. This thing still holds me in place, and to a degree, because my father, who is my abuser, did not pass at that time. And I think I didn't really put all the finishing touches to my healing journey. And when I had my hand on that, and I thought, this brings me the most shame. Like, this is just deep-rooted shame. And I don't think I could share with anybody what happened about my childhood. Although I shared with friends, I shared with family, but, openly, like we are talking about this right now. And I feel that there's a lot of societal pressures that where we don't have the space to talk about sexual abuse. And it does happen so often. It's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. And those are only the reported cases. So if you think about that, and I was not the brave soul who went and reported what had happened to me. So I was a person who kept silent and who was beholden to fear. And that was sort of like my journey in a sense of sharing this because I feel that so many survivors of any form of abuse, we become stuck in fear. And in that fear, there's also levels of shame. And when it becomes about sexual abuse, it even becomes more so. And if you are a female, that's one thing. And if you're a male, it is even deeper than that. And so society puts, well, I think society has, that's something where there's not a space created where we feel the comfort to talk about. I think we could talk about abuse, but sexual abuse is just a whole other level. And I
Right.
think that's why the situation perpetuates. I think that's why there's this incredible generational cycle of this happening over and over again. It's because education is one, and also just the freedom to talk about it. Then when we recognize and see ourselves in a different light or in different ways, then we have the ability to maybe have some introspection and look and go, oh, I'm not going to become this anymore. I don't want to continue in this pattern, or I may share this with somebody else. And those are all healing journeys, within the family or within yourself.
Yeah,
So that's how I
absolutely.
started.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like you said, the statistics do show the ones that report, and yet we often know in situations there's so much less that's not, so much more that's not reported because of what you said, because of shame. And often people who are sexually abused are abused by someone they know. And therefore, if you're a child, especially, there's a lot of guilt about reporting that because that person could go to jail because that's a criminal act. And especially if they're your caregiver and your parent, it's a lot to expect for a child to be able to do, or even an adult, because that would mean, especially in cases where we have, like in the United States, like a CPS getting involved, and they could, lose the person who's caring for them and providing financially for the family, whether it's a mother abusing a son, a father abusing a daughter, or any of those, possibilities, then it does make it quite difficult, because often what I hear from individuals who have experienced this is the abuser isn't always a monster. There's sometimes, good parts of them that you love, that you cherish. You've had good interactions as well as really hard ones. And even more so, the cognitive dissonance around, speaking up, because that act would cause that person to be harmed and you would feel responsible. Did you work through any of that as a child or as an adult?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, being in an authoritative place, when you put your trust into somebody, it could be your boss, it could be your best friend, your husband, your wife, your parents. I think there's a point that sometimes just being human, we all cross those boundaries where we kind of go, I took advantage, or I kind of bulldoze that situation. But it's also our responsibility to recognize that and stop ourselves. And I think that is one of it is the experience of being human. That is something that happens all the time, but it's also our responsibility to self-check ourselves and saying, oh no, oops, I don't want to take advantage of that. Or, that's a young child and, I have to behave appropriately with the right words. But when you have somebody who is the mindset of a pedophile or somebody who is a manipulator, that's a completely different ball game. Or somebody who comes from a very of an authoritative state where they manipulate and they know what they're doing, but they justify their actions. And I think that's a very difficult thing to sort through later. We don't understand it at that point. But even if you're a child or an adult and you step back, that's the hurtful thing. And that's the damaging pieces that we take along. If you're a child or you're an adult, or that is the, for me, it's about integrity. And that's the part where I think it is just heartbreaking, where you just kind of go, you just violated me in every way because I really trusted you in who you are. And I think that's when you come out, and that's, to me, a big violation. Yes, but sexual abuse it's taken it to a whole other level. But for me, it's along the same parallel of just being an abuser, that mindset.
Yeah, it is something, is being widely studied in terms of, these types of behaviors. Some great PhD research has come out even this year around this. But I think in terms of like how to help these individuals to stop these behaviors or to how to cure this and to go forward. I think there's a lot we still don't know. Therefore, the burden on the survivors, the targets of these individuals is especially hard because they know likely they're going to, whistleblow or send them into a situation where we're not even really sure how to help them move forward, which adds to the guilt, which already so much is put on survivors. Victim blaming is very common in this US culture, but in other cultures as well. Even when you have been a little girl and there was no way you deserved any of that. You were very young, however, I think around 5 years old. Am I correct?
Correct.
At what point did you start having the memories, like clear? I know that some people, and I read in your story, and I've read it in other stories as well, where at first it felt like it wasn't you, it was nightmares, but then you kind of realized it was real. And so at what point do you think you really understood that it was a real thing that happened?
I've always been a journaler, so I was able to keep, well, I'm not going to say it was a diary. It was just truly just thoughts. And so when I would have these nightmares, this is all part of post-traumatic stress disorder. So when I would have these nightmares that I couldn't make any sense with it, I would just write it on paper. I always felt like if you have something and it's just floating in your head, sometimes it's best just to write it on a piece of paper. Then you throw it away or whatever you want to do with it, burn it, tear it up. But so I write it up, these nightmares, and then I was able to put all of those shattered pieces together or a timeline or a story, because they were written in different ways over and over again. And so I was able to figure out what was going on. But I wasn't 100% sure until I had a conversation with my father. And in that process, my dad was a very manipulating, dominating, obviously a very unhealthy person, which I knew. And I never really cared for him, but I always felt like if I was going to sit down with him, like seriously sit down with him, I don't know how to explain this. I would kind of knowing if there's a dominant force, I would never take anything at heart. I would read between the lines. And so when I sat down with him and when I point blank asked him, did you touch me? Did you do any of these things? And where he was coming back and saying, well, maybe you saw it in a movie. Maybe you read it in a book. And then kind of deflecting and saying, oh, you poor you must be kind of insinuating that I was crazy. And when I thought, oh, okay, so now he's deflecting all these things. And then he was almost like heartbroken and started crying. And that is actually it's another way to manipulate too. And I thought, okay, so he's using that. And so I know you have to actually step back when you're with somebody who is a narcissist, and you have to just kind of go, I can't battle this, but you have to look at all the different tools that they use. And I think that is your best self-protection. And then look at that and go, oh, no, 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 no. I could see he's going to paint this in a different way. But what is my intuition telling me, though? Even though I don't trust my intuition because it's been broken so many times, but what is my heart and my intuition telling me? And then in that, I thought, no, I know he's lying, because I remember looking at him and feeling it all over my body and just knowing that my truth was right. And I think that was the next phase, the next stage of something. And I think we've all been there. I mean, have you ever been there in that situation where you just kind of go, oh my goodness, this is like a production, like a show, like an Academy Award, where you just sit back and go, wow.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think anybody who's familiar with the whole Darvo technique, right, which is the whole deny, attack, reverse the victim offender. We often see whether it's a pastor abusing someone with clergy sexual abuse or, a toxic boss, that they will often sometimes have these sort of crocodile tears, and often they can really conjure them up at the right moment. And then you start to feel bad as the victim because they seem like the victim instead. And so it actually works quite well. We see it in politics. We see it on all kinds of, personalities that probably have narcissistic personality disorder, because they end up on certain levels being able to lead at high levels, unfortunately, in a lot of organizations. Because I think, the understanding is that there's something that happened to them oftentimes that they don't want to look inward because it's too painful to look inward at what has happened to them maybe as a child. Therefore, they look outward, and there's a lot of blaming others for the behaviors they're doing, and they maybe even push those memories aside. They don't want to, deal with what that dark side of them has been doing. It's obviously very complicated. And I am not a psychologist. I just read a lot and have had others on the podcast. But part of what sticks out in your story is that you were able to trust yourself at some point, and I know that's a long and hard journey for many survivors. How old were you when you did confront your dad?
I would think I was probably about it was between 8, 9, and 10. And I have to say, I would dissociate a lot. And so a lot of what had happened, there's some things that I still just, I can't, I can't put a time. I know they happened. I don't know exactly the year, but I do remember the last time my father touched me. I was 10 years old, and that's because my father is a true pedophile and he's attracted to younger girls. So I had already started to go through puberty at 10, and he was no longer attracted to me. And plus, I started to really push back. I think I became very angry. And in a lot of ways, I hate to admit this, but I started to use the same divisive tools that he was using. I would use it on him. And I think that created fear in him. And that was also a point where I had to stop. It was an epiphany for me where I thought, I'm becoming my own father. I am actually becoming the monster. And how far do I want to take this? And I was at 10, and I remember, never underestimate a child, but I remember feeling that oh, I'm becoming the monster. And what now? How do I take accountability? And what do I want to become? Yeah.
What a lucid moment in a very confusing time, especially when it's your caregiver. So you don't ever feel safe in your own bed, in your own home. And that is the most hypervigilant situation I could possibly imagine for a child to endure. And at the same time, you seem to have a lot of lucid ability to have that moment for yourself, which I think is truly remarkable. And the thing is that some of the skills you need to survive as a child and that kind of abuse and trauma are not skills that are going to help you as an adult. So I love that your book is actually going into the hard things that I saw your YouTube videos with your dad and when you were confronting him in his older age. Truly so remarkable that you're so brave to not only expose this, but to, bring that out from your own family and your own personal experience. And that's what you're doing in this book too. As people listen to this and they maybe have experiences that are somewhat similar or they know someone, what are you kind of hoping people get out of reading your book and hearing your own personal story?
I do this solely to help others. I don't get paid for this. This is truly, because I've gone through this journey and I've gone through the timeline of being a young person, going through rage and anger, coming to healing, raising my children and finding boundaries with an abuser in the household, and then finding boundaries with family and establishing a relationship and working through that, that in my relationship with my husband. And that is a whole other part of it too. I just feel that because I've gone through this timeline, I guess you could say, I feel that there's so much wisdom in this. And I remember not believing that I would even survive my childhood. So my point of doing this is just to let other survivors know that yes, you will. You will be successful. You will come out of this. You have to work at it. There's baby steps, and you may even take a whole year off and not working so hard on yourself. But everything stems from self-love. I think finding others to support you, I think, is vital, and kind of finding a protective network that you could reach out to others, and you will come through. But I think it's to remove all those layers and try to rebuild yourself up again. I think that's just so important because you are worth saving. You are worthy of a beautiful life and having your dream and being a loving person, because we are all created out of love. So that is really that's where you started. It's this incredible journey to come through, and we are not exempt of heartache. We are not exempt of pain. So unfortunately, maybe some may have a little bit more than others, but you will come through. And I just really believe the more topics, the more conversations we have about this, it could possibly open a platform for others to share their story. And once we share more stories, we have more conversations, I think a lot more resources can be in place and problem solutions or solving solutions to sexual abuse.
Absolutely agree. Thank you so much. How can people find you? I'm going to have you hang out with our Patreon supporters. We'll ask you another question there, but how can people find you and your book and your writing?
I'm basically in every bookstore, probably Amazon. I find that most people just find Amazon to be an easier one, and www.cindytalks.com. And that's the best way to reach me.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for both your vulnerability, your courage, your honesty. You're truly an inspiration. I'm so grateful for you that you came forward. I believe you. It's awful what happened to you. You did not deserve it. And I'm so grateful that you did choose to speak out and find the courage to do so, because it really is making a difference. Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
That conversation was really inspiring for me and heartbreaking. And I just found myself really checking in with myself during that interview about how I was feeling and processing some of the things that Cindy was saying. So I could imagine you might be finding yourself in that same situation. Whether you yourself have experienced sexual abuse or abuse of any kind, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, there's so many different types of abuse, and it can occur in a workplace, in a community, in a faith space, in a home, in a school, on public transportation. There's so many places and spaces where abuse has occurred to so many different types of people. And because we are raising mental health awareness about what it takes to be healthy mentally, often that's a lot of work for some of us who have experienced things that were outside of our locus of control, things that happened to us, sometimes in less than 20 seconds. It could be words, it could be an abusive form of physical interaction, sexual, psychological, like many different types of abuse that exists out there. And so as Cindy unpacks the various types that she experienced and growing up in a home where she didn't feel safe on many levels, psychologically, physically, sexually, relationally, and, all the ways that that type of abuse affects you in your own home is tremendously overwhelming for children. My heart absolutely breaks for Cindy for what she experienced, and for many of you who have experienced that. And if that is something that you have walked through, I really do hope that you check out the resource that she mentions when I interview her on our Patreon Difference Maker interview, which is an exclusive interview if you're a part of that community. And I really hope you join us there, because we get to unpack a few more things. But one of the things that she mentions is RAIN. We're going to link that in the show notes if you haven't heard of them. It's an organization that does give resources to people who've experienced abuse. And once again, there are many resources. If you didn't yet listen to our interview that's very recent with Dr. Chuck DeGroat in his most recent book, Healing What's Within, he unpacks trauma and how to heal from that as a therapist. And also he talks about in the book some of the ways that he walked through that himself and how he has healed. But I also hope that you do pick up Cindy's book because, you heard her talk about today how food has been a huge part of her life around the world, different cuisines and that type of thing. But she really starts off the book talking about noticing and being mindful of sensory experiences. And I think that, getting in touch with your body is really important because, she mentions experiences of dissociation in the moment of being abused. And that is something that's quite common, especially with childhood sexual abuse. And so learning to just be mindful and knowing that you're here and it's now, and using grounding techniques can be very helpful for people walking through PTSD or CPTSD. We've had therapists here on the show talk about that. People have written about that. If you haven't had a therapist yourself, I would highly encourage you to get one, no matter what you're walking through, whether you consider yourself to have had any traumatic experience or not. It's quite common for people to walk through various types of trauma and not even recognize that's what's happened to you. And it could be an ongoing situation, or it could be a one-time event like a earthquake or a tsunami, or it could be an abusive situation that's ongoing, or various types of things. But I think that in light of what Cindy has shared with us today, is that it is a journey of healing, and she certainly has put in the work and has made some intentional choices for herself. She absolutely could not control what happened to her, but she's doing her very best and has done her very best to walk through a healing journey. That doesn't take it all away, because there are scars that remain, but healing is possible. And I really am so inspired by her story and the way that this isn't her full-time job. She's not doing this all the time, but she does do interviews like this around her book, her memoir, to give her a chance to speak and to inspire others that you're not alone if you've gone through something like this. This happens to people. There's no country in the world that something like this probably hasn't touched. This is an area where, unfortunately, it stays hidden and it stays secret. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because speaking out can be additionally dangerous for a child, especially if that means their parent would be no longer able to be their caregiver. It's a significant thing. And so, there are many reasons why it takes a long time for this to come to light. And I'm so just honored that she would share her story on this podcast today. She goes into much more detail, of course, in her book. And I would encourage you, if you're up for it and that's something that would be helpful to you, is to check out her website, cindytalks.com, where she has a few YouTube videos on there, just short ones, where she has conversations with her father when he's much older, and she's, an adult at this point, and he is, I think, if I'm not wrong, somewhere around 80 years old, and has a conversation with him. And I just, maybe that would be something that would be helpful for you as you sort of unpack what it would look like to start to talk about something that may have happened to you a long time ago. So thank you so much for just being present in this conversation. I do hope that you just notice around you what you see in the room. Maybe make a note of 4 or 5 things that you can see, something you can smell, something you can touch, something you can hear. Just being aware of your senses can be a way of grounding yourself, to remind you that you're here and you're now and you're safe and you're not in the past. Because one of the things that trauma does is it kind of makes our body feel like it's back in the past in that moment. And so grounding techniques can be very helpful to remind you that you're here and you're now in this moment with us, listening to this podcast wherever you are in the world. I'm here in the UK right now recording this portion of it. I recorded the interview when I was in Oregon, and traveled just the next day back to home, and then flew out to the UK. So recording this intro and outro here, but wherever you are, I hope that you know that you matter and that you deserve to heal if you've walked through any type of trauma. And that on this week of Mental Health Awareness Day, I hope that you know that whatever health looks like for you, that you deserve to find that. So I always say it like this, our brain is an organ. And so if your heart was not well, you would go to a cardiologist. And if you had something going on with your nervous system, you would go to a neurologist. The brain is connected to that as well. If you have something wrong with your back or your muscles, you would go to like an occupational therapist who could help you figure out ways to help your muscles heal in the right way. Your liver, you would go to a specialist for that's. And so, of course, healing any of those organs, we tend to not have a lot of shame around that. But for some reason, in a lot of cultures, there is still some shame and some stigma around taking care of your mental health, and as if something is extra wrong if you are suffering mentally from something that's happened to you or a condition that you have. And so I just want you to know that here we don't have a stigma around that. You're on this podcast. Health is health. Healing is healing, whatever part of your body that resides in. And when it comes to mental health, it does tend to affect all of health. So being unwell in terms of, your mental state can really affect how your body feels, the kind of sleep that you get or don't get, and that affects so many other things that can tend to have a ripple effect. So it's especially important to take care of your mental health and to make sure you're checking in with professionals that can help you if that's not something you feel like you can walk through alone. And often that's the case. So I just want you to know that you matter, and whatever you're walking through, you deserve to be able to heal, and you deserve a life of flourishing where you flourish and you help others around you flourish. And that as you make a difference in your own life, whatever small step that looks like for you today, that you are making a difference for others, because the healthier you are, the healthier you show up in all your relationships at work and at home and your community. And then just because you deserve to heal, just for you, because you matter and you are loved, and caring for yourself and practicing that self-care and taking care of your mental health is a step that I absolutely encourage you to do. I'm grateful for the people in my life, for my village of people that encourage me to take care of myself too, because it takes a village often to heal from things like trauma. So I hope that if you don't have one, that you can sort of handpick one around you to support you, people that will encourage you to walk forward in a healing journey. And certainly Cindy is the kind of person who's cheering you on too. And that's why she wanted to speak out and come on the show today, was to let you know how important it is to heal, and that she's gone through the hard work and is still going through that hard work, and to inspire you to come along on that journey too. Wherever you are in the world today, I wish you flourishing and health mentally and in all parts of you. And that as you pursue that, you will be the kind of inspiration Cindy is to us, to others, when they see that because you're doing it, they can do it too. And that's how that kind of works, right? It's a little bit contagious when we see others taking those steps. It encourages us to as well. So grateful for Cindy. Please check out her book and her website. We'll link that in the show notes. Her book is called Under the Orange Blossoms, and you can find her at cindytalks.com. Wherever you are in the world, just know that you matter to me, and you really are so special. And I hope that you practice some self-care today. Keep making a difference for yourself wherever you are.